When you think about the people who have been most vulnerable to climate change and pollution, who do you think of? Do you think about the people of Flint, Michigan, who had lead and Legionella bacteria plague their water supply?
Flint's tap water was laced with dangerous levels of lead. The state knew about it and did nothing.
Or how about communities living along an 85-mile stretch of Louisiana dubbed Cancer Alley as toxic petrochemical plants poison the air?
Environmental injustice and racism can look like many things. It can be toxic petrochemical plants in Louisiana's Cancer Alley or lead in Flint, Michigan's water.
Or maybe you think about the Standing Rock Sioux tribe protesting the construction of the Dakota Access Pipeline.
Pipelines aren't built through Beverly Hills. They're built through indigenous reservations, and all of this is purposeful.
Environmental injustices are all around us. And while the Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, has held an office focused on environmental justice since 1992, we find ourselves in a critical moment in history to systemically address these inequities. The Inflation Reduction Act has provided historic amounts of money to invest in a sustainable future, and the White House's Justice 40 initiative promises that 40% of federal investments in climate change, green energy, housing, and workforce development will flow into communities disproportionately impacted by pollution and climate change. But where is that money going, and what will those investments look like? Welcome to Empathy Affect, Forsmarsh Media's podcast that explores the human side of government. I'm Melissa Harris-Zazinski, and as we kick off our second season of the show, we're going to answer these questions and understand what our government is doing to support the environmental justice movement. We're joined by Dr. Matthew Tejada, EPA Deputy Assistant Administrator for Environmental Justice, who will share how the government is working to make grants, technical assistance, and the change we seek easier to access. Matthew, it's an honor to have you on Empathy Effect today to talk about your and the EPA's work around environmental justice. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Of course. I think it's a great place to start this conversation by understanding the environmental justice movement, which is deeply rooted in the civil rights movement, grassroots organizing, and really got its legs in the 1980s. We know the EPA officially opened its Office of Environmental Justice in 1992. So how have you seen the EJ movement evolve, and what is the federal government's role in the movement's history?
Sure. I mean, that's a great place to start. So the environmental justice movement, which really got started back in the 1980s, that advocated for a governmental response and acknowledgement of the issues of environmental justice across the United States. And those issues are really very, again, deep-seated generational issues where certain communities in our country, typically, communities of color, indigenous communities, low-income white communities, they have not had the power to do a couple of simple but very important things. They've been dumped on and disinvested in for centuries in many instances. So the environmental justice movement was really about, we need systemic and structural change. We need to advance equity and justice through the systems of government in the United States to start to redress those centuries-long issues of being dumped on and disinvested in. And it's those same communities, again, communities of color, indigenous communities, low-income white communities that have not all benefited from EPA's efforts. And that's really the job of the environmental justice program going back to 1992 through to today, that it really is about advancing the need to make sure we equally protect and justly treat all communities in the United States. And that means we really need to appreciate those histories of certain communities being dumped on, of certain communities being disinvested in, of certain communities being marginalized by governmental processes. And that's what our EJ program has been working on for over 30 years now.
Yeah, just building off of that, how would you consider ongoing environmental movements, activism, and advocacy in the ongoing march of the federal government's work in environmental justice?
Well, yeah, I think we've seen a historic uplift in this administration during the Biden-Harris administration of really centering not just the efforts of an agency like EPA, but but really to have it come from the White House and to reemphasize part of President Clinton's initial call on environmental justice that he signed in Executive Order 12898 back in 1994, that you really need more than EPA to do this, right? It is not just about how we, regulate environmental public health protection, but it's also about what do we do with transportation? What do we do with housing? What do we do in rural spaces? What do we do with the land? What is the role of the Department of Justice? So it's really been in this administration that for the first time since 1994, not only have we had an update to that original executive order from 1994, we've had around 12 different executive orders that President Biden has signed that have something to do with racial equity, with justice, with advancing rights. Significantly, just this past April, the president signed a new executive order that kind of updated and refreshed everything, having a clear definition for environmental justice for the entire federal government.
To be more specific, EO 14096 defines environmental justice as the just and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of income, race, color, national origin, tribal affiliation, or disability, in agency decision-making and other federal activities that affect human health and the environment, so that people are fully protected from disparate health and environmental effects and have equitable access to healthy, sustainable, and resilient environments. While the EO goes into more detail about expanding its definition of communities at the heart of the EJ movement and the all-of-government call to action, that pivot to just treatment from fair treatment is a big deal.
Folks haven't been treated fairly and equally for generations. So if you just start treating them fairly now, you're really locking in that inequitable gap that many communities still suffer from. So it updated that terminology from fair treatment to just treatment, because just treatment, that idea of justice, recognizes that some communities have been left behind and they really need their interests prioritized, not to do something special for them, but just to bring them up to the same level of investment, of protection, of enjoyment of natural resources that other communities already benefit from.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I also just wanted to take a moment for our listeners to get to know you, since your background in this space is incredibly enlightening and I think important to understand where you come from with this work. And it's also important since I think climate change and environmental justice requires a very sort of diverse background of skills. It's a mix of the science, the community organizing, the policymaking, the humanitarian assistance. And I understand that you have a really rich background in international studies, in your academics, and then you spent time in the Balkans and with the Peace Corps. These experiences touch on all these different aspects. So can you share a bit about your journey getting into environmental justice and how each of these experiences has manifested in your work today?
Sure. Yeah, it does. It does look a little meandering, maybe a little purposeless, but it does all actually, at least for me, since I'm the one who lived it, it does kind of make sense. So I grew up, it really goes back to, kind of how and where I grew up. Most of my family and the family that we really are kind of rooted in come from northern New Mexico. That's where almost all of my family is from, kind of everywhere from Albuquerque up to Taos, except for my brothers and I. My two brothers and I were the only part of our family that weren't born and raised in that part of the country. My dad and mom, when my dad graduated college from New Mexico State, like many good New Mexicans who managed to get a 4-year degree, there's many more opportunities outside of New Mexico than inside of New Mexico. So he got his first job at an electric utility in Texas, and that's where my brothers and I were all born and raised in Texas, and wound up, as a lot of folks who are starting a family and not coming from means. We were raised for the first half of my childhood in a predominantly low income community of color, kind of on the outskirts of Fort Worth, Texas, and had our good experiences there. But it was certainly a pretty stark place to grow up, especially, going back and forth between, that community in Fort Worth and where our family was all at, in Albuquerque and Santa Fe and other places. Then halfway through my childhood, we picked up and moved out to the suburbs. We moved to the opposite side of a lake. We had grown up on the side of the lake where the power plant was built. So we grew up kind of in the shadow of the power plant, which was the reason for the lake being built. And we moved to the other side, to the suburb, where you could actually go to the lake. You could actually go fishing. If you had means, you could put a boat in the water and, boat in that part of the lake where the part of town where we'd grown up before, you couldn't do that. And it was the photo negative of where we'd been growing up. I was one of, like 2 or 3 white kids in my 3rd grade class. And in 4th grade, there were 2 or 3 black kids in my 4th grade class. It was really stark to me, but I didn't know what to do with it. But I just saw differences in these 3 communities that I was exposed to throughout my childhood. And I didn't know why, but I knew that there was something wrong with it. I knew that there was some sort of implicit unfairness happening. So I think for a long time, I was just searching for some sort of a way to do something about that.
That searching led Matthew to college, where he studied English and Spanish at the University of Texas at Austin, and then in the Peace Corps, where he found his call for service. After being stationed in Bulgaria, he served as a high school English teacher. These experiences brought Matthew to a new point in his career, where he went to Oxford to study Russian and East European studies. As Matthew said before, it may seem like a winding road, but the dots between civil rights, environmental justice, and his education were all just finding this moment to align.
And so when I went to college, wound up writing a master's dissertation about this big controversy that had been happening throughout the 90s in Bulgaria, because they had 6 Soviet-built nuclear reactors, and they were some of the first nuclear reactors that Westerners entered into after the fall of communism in Eastern Europe. And they wanted them to shut them down. And the Bulgarians were like, well, that's 70% of our electricity. We can't shut these down. So there was just this long controversy about these Soviet nuclear reactors. So I wrote my dissertation just kind of documenting all of that and talking about the policies related to it and everything else. But in that work, I did a lot of my primary research with a bunch of the advocates and activists from, the end of communism into the development of democracy in Bulgaria, because they had a lot of the records, they had a lot of the lived experience of actually fighting against communism. And the thing that really started them was really kind of a public health justice frame. There were towns that were being gassed by industrial pollution, and people couldn't stop, their children from being gassed by these major manufacturers in the Balkans. So people finally started to protest and started to pick up, and that was really the development of their democratic civil society in Bulgaria. So just they had this incredible story that nobody had told. So I was asked to stay on and do a doctorate, and I wrote the history of that environmental movement in Bulgaria and their role in really bringing down communism and developing democracy, and just got to spend, 2 more years just researching them and hanging out with them and talking with all these activists and advocates and, sports figures and artists and politicians. And that just got me super fired up to go back to Texas in a weird way. There's a lot of similarities between the Eastern Balkans and Texas, a lot of the ways they operate. But that was, I knew at that point, like I wanted to go back to Texas. I wanted to fight for rights. I wanted to fight for the environment and for public health. I wanted to fight for folks that were being dumped upon unfairly.
So Matthew came back to Texas. After a year of searching, he entered a position running a nonprofit called Air Alliance Houston that started as an environmental justice organization in the 1980s. It had already been a struggling group at the time, on the brink of shutting down, but Matthew got its grassroots work back and running, getting into organizing, citizen science, litigation. It was a moment for him to not only learn about environmental justice, but take part in it. Then, early on in the Obama administration, the White House tapped him to bring that groundwork organizing and expertise to reinvigorate the EPA's Office of Environmental Justice, which he has directed since. Now that we've gotten to know you a bit, Matthew, I just want to focus on the present. The Biden administration has been making some historic movements in the EJ space between milestones like the Inflation Reduction Act and its funding to address climate change, and the Justice 40 initiative, which promises that 40% of federal investments in climate change, clean energy, affordable housing, and even more flow to disadvantaged communities impacted by pollution. Since you've been at the EPA for over a decade now, how are you seeing these investments from the IRA and the commitment from Justice 40 impacting the EPA's EJ work and the work that you and other agencies do together to tackle environmental injustices?
I honestly believe, and since I'm not a lawyer or anything else, I very rarely get to say I'm going to speak authoritatively. But as a historian, I'm going to say I'm going to speak authoritatively for a second. I honestly believe the period we're living through right now, for several reasons, is a hugely historic watershed moment in the history of humanity. We've had so much happen all at once between a lot of the advocacy and activism coming from the grassroots around racial justice and racial equity issues, an administration that really, in an unprecedented way, has embraced connecting histories in this country to persistent issues of injustice, of inequity across our society. So things like Justice 40, even though the nuts and bolts of how to really implement it, program by program, benefit by benefit, are still being worked out. I don't think a lot of folks appreciated just how hard a job that was going to be when Justice 40 was launched. I'm not saying that the president realized, I'm sure the president realized, but I think a lot of folks just looked at it and it was like, well, 40%, that's easy. 40% off the top, whatever, and this will be easy. I was like, no. This is, Justice 40 is looking at hundreds of different programs across the federal government, some of which are decades old, some of which are brand new, and trying to figure out, how to track benefits and what does that mean and what does the transparency of that look like and what's the accountability and how do you make decisions, whether that's a program that goes immediately from the federal government down to the community, or if it's a program that goes through a chain of a dozen transactions, right? Justice 40 itself just as this policy priority, with the clarity and the very strong mandate it put out into government in the United States, it has caused huge change to happen. Change that, somebody that has been in this space for a decade at the government level, we've never had such eagerness, such willingness, such opportunity at all levels of government, with other federal agencies, with our state partners, with folks at the local government level, dealing with our tribal colleagues, and a nation-to-nation responsibility. We've never had so much interest in space and willingness to say, well, who is benefiting from that program and why? Why is that community that we all know has been having, hasn't had drinking water in forever, or, hasn't had a sewer hookup in 50 years? Like, why is that still a thing, especially in this time when we have unprecedented resources? Like, shouldn't Justice 40 really force us to examine why government operates in that way and to make some changes? So even though there's not, program by program guidance yet on exactly what should happen and where those benefits go and everything else, there is a very clear dynamic that is playing out in real time across the United States, where people are finally asking those really hard questions. They see all of these, generational resources coming down from the federal government now. And at the same time, they're seeing the generational challenges that they've never really before been able to tackle and do something about. And folks are finally getting it, like, oh, we're going to have to change some of the systems and structures of government, but we have the support to do that. We have the resources to do that. And if we do that, we might actually start to solve a lot of really gnarly problems that have been too much for most folks to even contemplate really trying to wrap their hands around before. And that's causing real positive change to happen in places all across the United States right now.
Definitely. And, part of the funding that has been coming through has manifested in some of the grant work that you can provide to folks and the technical assistance that you can provide. So I want to get into the technical assistance in a bit, because you guys have been setting a great model, in my opinion, for how agencies such as yourself can consider adopting such strategies. But can you walk us through some of the EJ grant programs that the EPA has? And if you could share some of examples of very exciting ways that grant money has been used, And perhaps, if you're a listener out there who wants to tap into it, where do they even start?
Sure. It has been so exciting, challenging, but challenging in a good way for us in the EJ program at EPA, where we've gone in a matter of a little over 2 years from having about $1.5 million annually to spend on all of our grants and technical assistance to going into this reality where we actually have more than $3 billion because our baseline appropriation went from about $10 million to $100 million for the entire EJ program. And the majority of that is going to go out as grants and technical assistance in addition to the $3 billion we've received through the Inflation Reduction Act.
Wow.
It gave us the opportunity to finally take decades of what we've been working on in terms of, those much smaller grant and technical assistance programs that we've been implementing and crafting and constantly evolving over the decades, to take our entire experience and knowledge built up over that time, but also to take just everything that EJ leaders, that EJ organizations, that the movement has been asking for and demanding for decades. And kind of the backbone to that is this very old idea, this idea that one of the biggest barriers to communities receiving the investments and the benefits they deserve is because they don't have the capacity to reach up to government and grab the things that are out there, right? To get the money to fix the water pipes, to get the money to have better housing, to get the money to have access to transit or healthcare or food or to deal with climate change issues. It's just that capacity issue. And it's been really hard from the government to figure out, because a lot of folks, if you haven't been in government, you don't understand how tricky it is to actually use taxpayer dollars. That they come with all these strings and all of these guardrails on them and different accounts and different ways you can spend them. So the funding we received actually wound up being really flexible, and we could use it to finally establish a nationwide network of hub and spoke technical assistance centers that would provide that really foundational level of assistance that thousands and tens of thousands of communities across the United States need, whether that's actually like community-based organizations or whether that's, tribal organizations or rural local governments, right? There, a lot of them have those very base or very foundational technical assistance needs. Like, how do you set up a nonprofit? How do you lay out an annual budget? How do you get your utility to convene with the community that's most impacted so they can actually come up with a plan together, right? How do you navigate the thousands of different programs available across the federal government to find the one that best matches your need and get yourself in position to apply for it? So we developed these thriving community technical assistance centers, or TICTACs, where we now have a nationwide network of regionally based and kind of national umbrella organizations that are starting to open their doors as we speak to actually provide that sort of foundational technical assistance to build the capacity of thousands of places across the United States to get in the game, right? That is a huge thing that folks have been asking for a really long time. And it's really the backbone of everything we're doing. The fact that these TICTACs are actually developing a nationwide network of technical assistance providers. And it is a little scary because we're doing it all at once. We didn't have the time or the luxury to kind of pilot this in a couple places and kind of build out, slowly. We had to build this nationwide network from go. And honestly, we were in EPA, we were a little worried early on, just in terms of, would people show up? Would we get enough applicants to even try to make this network a thing? And we were blown away that EJ leaders, EJ organizations, and a lot of their partners, like academic institutions and others, really rallied and are showing up in this space and have enabled us to develop this nationwide network from go.
The enthusiasm behind the TICTACs allowed the EPA to select its first 16 technical assistance centers this past September. While the EPA and these centers are just getting on their feet, they'll serve as the foundation for exciting new infrastructure and programming in the EJ space. One of these is the EPA's Thriving Community Grantmakers' recent announcement. This new program aims to lower the bar for communities to receive federal grant funding for EJ projects.
There is such a high bar on applying for and receiving taxpayer dollars directly from the federal government. So in complement to those Tic Tacs, later this calendar year, we'll be announcing our Thriving Community Grant Makers. And those grant makers are partnerships of community organizations with some academic partners. They have taken on the burden of coming to EPA and going through the federal application and acquisition process. They're actually going through that process right now as we sit here talking in November of 2023. And they very soon will be awarded sums of money that they will then be able to turn around, and they'll be able to subgrant that money out to thousands of communities. They'll be able to operate on a scale that we wouldn't be able to match if we were making all those grants from the federal government. And they'll also be able to do it in a way where communities won't face that barrier of applying to the federal government. They'll have a simplified application process. Communities will still have to apply, but it's not going to be the burden of a community coming to the federal government to get $150,000 just so they can start to do some planning, right? Just so they can start to talk to their utility, or so, the community can start to talk to their tribal government. That level of funding, $150,000, $250,000, up to $350,000, there'll be these grant makers, these Thriving Community Grant Makers, again, will be a nationwide network of service providers providing that financial assistance that really complements that foundational technical assistance that the Tic Tacs will be providing. And then kind of on top of it all, also this year, before the end of the year, we're going to announce our Environmental and Climate Justice Community Change Grants. And those grants really will be transformational for the communities that receive them. They're going to provide between $10 and $20 million per award for communities to really finally start having the support to implement solutions to their environmental and climate challenges, right? Actually start, putting solutions on the ground, actually improving conditions. And also, kind of the sweet spot that we're trying to hit with those community change grants is really catalyzing those communities to then be able to receive, the $100 million from HUD, or the $50 million from the Department of Agriculture, or the big transportation grant from Department of Transportation, right? To really catalyze removing all of those barriers and filling all of those gaps that exist in disadvantaged communities that really prevent them from being able to access the big resources that can then really start solving those generational challenges. So all of that is going to be available and out there by the end of 2023.
That's fantastic. And we're really looking forward to it, and for you giving us the sneak peek before the end of the year. As you were just mentioning there, you're implementing this great model with the Tic Tacs, with the new programs you're having. And I know that with Justice 40, lots of other agencies also need to make sure that they're allocating their resources and programming and funding in an equitable way as well. And so I've been seeing other agencies trying to develop technical assistance models like the one you're mentioning, who are very early on their journeys. And since the EPA has been at this for so long, I'm wondering if you had advice for other agencies or organizations who are trying to do this. What would it be?
I think one of the first things is to do the hard and unsexy work of coordinating with other federal agencies. That's one of the things that early on, we at EPA, we actually got together with our colleagues at Department of Transportation and a couple other organizations, Department of Energy and HUD. But we launched what we've called the Thriving Community Network. And that's why those words, Thriving Community, feature in a lot of our grants, is we committed to each other to do the really unsexy work of, in a nuts and bolts way, trying to line up the assistance that we were going to put out in the space. There is no such thing as like a technical assistance provider that's going to answer all of the questions and provide everything that especially communities that have been disinvested in for generations need. They're going to have to access multiple forms of assistance. They're going to have to access, several grant programs. And for us to be able to show up as a government and have our stuff aligned and coordinated with one another is something, again, folks have been asking for a long time. But the leadership of a lot of the folks in this administration sitting down inside of the bureaucracy and figuring out, okay, if EPA is going to do these Tic Tacs, well, here's what we're going to do on technical assistance over at DOT and HUD. If you have those pieces, like really trying to set up an ecosystem of technical assistance provision and other resources, including, how to get our our regional folks more involved in that, because we all have, staff scattered across the United States that are actually on the front lines of helping to implement a lot of these projects and programs. So figuring out, how to really do that in a programmatic way, not just saying, well, we're going to look to do it in 10 places and maybe some magic will happen and maybe it'll magically help transform, government to act in a more equitable way, but actually from the outset to say, no, we're going to do this programmatically. We want to really advance, the systems and structures of government to operate more equitably and to operate in this, again, this ecosystem where the Tic Tacs know that there's going to be other TA providers doing other stuff. And those TA providers know that the Tic Tacs are going to be out there. So they should be referencing one another and feeding into one another and making sure that, as communities and community-driven partnerships come into the government to start accessing resources, that they should be facilitating, sending those community-driven partnerships and their projects in different directions so that we can align our support underneath their projects.
I just want to wrap up here by noting, we've covered so much ground. It's really exciting hearing about these historic investments and movement that we're able to make, and that there's still challenges. People out there are still frustrated and anxious about climate change. You expressed some of the barriers that you're even facing. And, as climate change seems to be such an insurmountable thing, some people still may be skeptical about whether our government can act fast enough to ensure we're sustainable and resilient. So as we end today, what do you want to tell our listeners so that they can not only have hope, but know that they can take action?
I think the biggest thing is we've never had the chance to support communities in driving the agenda, in innovating and being creative, in developing the solutions that best work for their communities. And whether those solutions are dealing with legacy pollution issues or dealing with still evolving impacts from climate change, or looking at, ensuring that as we fix the environment, that folks aren't displaced out of their communities, that we have economic revitalization, wealth creation and retention by the local community so that future generations of that community get to enjoy that good for decades and decades to come. We've never supported that, not in a serious way and not across the United States. We have that opportunity right now. We have the opportunity for thousands of engines of innovation to be built and launched from the communities across the United States to develop solutions, to work in partnership with their local governments, with their tribes, with their states, with us, with the private sector, with academic institutions. This is the first time we've had this chance across our country. And if folks don't show up for it, that chance has no chance, right? It will pass us by. So regardless of how hard it is, which we all understand, and especially for folks out there on the front lines who are typically showing up for this hard job uncompensated, right? They're doing this on nights and weekends. They're sacrificing their family time. They are doing everything they can on extra hours, trying to take advantage of this and trying to make it pay for their communities. For folks to hang in there on that, for folks that are still not sure if they should get in this fight right now, get in this game and start helping figure this out, now is the time, right? We will not get another chance at this if we don't make this one show that using taxpayer dollars in this way, supporting ground up community-driven solutions to really challenging problems, developing those partnerships and those collaborations, that's not just a good use of taxpayer dollars. It's actually one of the best uses of taxpayer dollars because it is going to solve some problems that nobody else has been able to solve before. But that is the chance we have right now. That is the opportunity in front of us with this administration, with things like Justice 40, with funding like the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act. That is all right in front of us right now. And we have got to collectively, whether you're in the government, whether you're out in the local level, whether you're in one of those partnership institutions, we have all got to show up authentically to engage the community, to support the community, to uplift that community at coming up with those solutions and making this pay so that everyone sees it.
Thank you so much. It's been so lovely getting to know you, learning about the federal government's work in environmental justice, and this particularly important moment that we're in. I hope that our listeners feel refreshed and hopeful and know that this is an important time where they can feel empowered.
Thanks, Melissa.
Listeners, I hope you can shortly see all of the environmental justice work mentioned today in action. Since we recorded this interview, the EPA actually announced that it has opened up $2 billion in grants through its Thriving Community Change Grant, the one Matthew mentioned in our conversation. These grants are the single largest investment in environmental justice made by any administration. If you want to learn more about the grant program or TIC-TACs that we talked about today, we'll link to them in the show notes, where you can also find a link to our media and stay up to date on any news in this space. I hope your holidays and the new year are very healthy and happy. We'll see you in the beginning of January 2024, kicking off the big presidential election year with a conversation around trust and security in elections.
Election experts warned that American democracy is under great stress, adding, "We can no longer take for granted that people will accept election results."
The idea is to have channels of communication so that people who want to get more facts, who are concerned about whether elections are being fairly conducted, can have confidence that they actually have been, and that the people are doing the right thing, who are behind the scenes ensuring that our democracy continues to function.
Joining us will be former Homeland Security Department's Senior Election Security Advisor, Kim Wyman. We'll get ready to learn about how our country has bolstered its election infrastructure and security for 2024. So make sure to follow and subscribe to catch the episode when it releases. Thanks for tuning in this time, and we hope you'll join us next month.
Empathy Effect is a product of Forrest Marsh. You can reach us at forrestmarshmedia@forrestmarsh.com with any feedback, questions, or inquiries. If you want to know more about today's guest, are interested in participating with Forrest Marsh, or becoming part of our community, check out our show notes for more information.